Charles Dickens was one of the most popular, most prolific, and most influential writers of the 19th century. His novels and short stories not only influenced other authors, but helped shape public opinion about some of the terrible social inequalities of the Victorian era, which led to new laws to protect the most vulnerable in society. With success coming at such a young age, he was 24 when the Pickwick Papers took off, it meant that for most of his adult life, Dickens was held up as a pillar of virtue and a champion of the downtrodden. But Dickens was a far more complex character, who behaved at times more like one of his villains than the paragon everyone believed him to be.
Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston, and today I'm continuing my exploration of the extraordinary but rather secretive life of Charles Dickens.
In part 1 we learned about his difficult childhood, family debt and the hard months he had to endure working in a rat-infested factory, his first steps as a cheeky young legal clerk, his efforts to improve himself, his emergence as a new voice on the London literary scene, and the incredible success he enjoyed with his first 6 novels that lifted him out of poverty forever.
In this second part, we pick up the story in 1844. Dickens, now 32, was basking in the acclaim that greeted A Christmas Carol, and on the surface he was a happily married man with a loving wife and 5 healthy children. But he was a man of boundless energy and strong passions, and he was never going to be content to just sit at home and watch his quiet and dutiful wife do her embroidery.
The reception of his latest novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, proved rather disappointing, so Dickens decided he needed some time off, and that perhaps the reading public did too. What could be better than an educational trip to Italy with the family, to take the air and see the sights? Travelling first through France and then on to Genoa and the northern cities, with a quick trip back to London halfway through to give a reading of his latest Christmas book, The Chimes, then back again to complete the job. Moving between modest inns and grand hotels and renting houses for longer stays, the entourage was away for almost a year, getting as far south as the temples of Paestum, standing majestically on a wild malaria-blighted plain, with Dickens, as always, noting down everything he observed. We don't associate Italy with malaria now, but it was a major health problem in the 19th century, with 2 million cases and up to 20,000 deaths per year. Naturally, they visited all the major sites of the classical Grand Tour: Milan, Verona, Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples, and Pompeii. His account of the journey, Pictures from Italy, is more than just a travelogue, as Dickens includes his characteristic social commentary, highlighting the contrasts between the grand buildings and the poverty that surrounded them. Rome he was not particularly impressed with, however, feeling it looked much like London, and confessed to having gone to bed on his first night in a very indifferent humour and with a very considerably quenched enthusiasm. While he was away, he practised his latest hobby on family and friends, mesmerism. Originally an 18th century craze, mesmerism or hypnosis, named after the charismatic German physician Anton Mesmer, enjoyed a revival in the 1830s.
Dr. John Elliotson, Professor of Practical Medicine at University College Hospital, London, where I began my training, was a firm believer in the value of mesmerism in medical treatment, and he gave public demonstrations which Dickens attended.
They became friends, and Dickens learned the mesmeric technique from Elliotson and began experimenting on his wife and family. Whilst in Genoa, he had a go at treating the English-born wife of a Swiss banker who had suffered for years with headaches, insomnia, tics, and dramatic convulsions. She was also frightened of a supernatural being that she called the Phantom, and which she claimed appeared regularly before her. These symptoms are very typical of the cases of hysteria treated by Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris later in the century and studied by a young Sigmund Freud. When, after a few sessions, Madame de la Rue reported feeling calmer and sleeping better, it confirmed Dickens's view that mesmerism worked and that he was a skilled practitioner. Mainstream medicine was hostile to the procedure, however, especially when it began to incorporate spiritualist ideas. But Dickens continued to believe in its effectiveness, although he preferred scientific explanations over invocations of the supernatural. The family returned via the famous St. Gothard Pass to Switzerland and Belgium. Back home in London, he came up with the idea of starting a liberal newspaper to counter the more conservative Times. After securing funding, the first edition of the Daily News appeared on the 21st of January 1846, with the aim of promoting the principles of progress and improvement, of education, civil and religious liberty, and equal legislation. He employed his friend and fellow social reformer Douglas Jerrold as sub-editor and put his father in charge of the reporters. He also paid his father-in-law George Hogarth 5 guineas a week to write about music.
So, although Dickens was a fierce critic of nepotism in the civil service, he was not averse to adding a few family members to the payroll himself.
The newspaper frequently attacked the iniquitous corn laws, which had kept the price of food artificially high for years, favouring landowners but resulting in food shortages and widespread starvation.
He only lasted 10 weeks in the job, however, before resigning due to frustrations with one of the owners and sheer exhaustion.
Trying to think of what to do next, he came up with the idea of establishing a rehabilitation home for fallen women, and he wrote a 14-page letter setting out his thoughts to Angela Burdett Coutts, one of the wealthiest women in the country, a deeply religious banking heiress who was using her enormous inheritance to fund multiple worthy causes, including ragged schools for poor children, housing projects, hospitals, and new churches. Oh yes, she was also the president of the British Goat Society. He also continued his trips to the continent. He loved France and gave a speech in Paris saying the French were the first people in the universe. While he was there, he met all the literary heavyweights, Alexandre Dumas, Théophile Gautier, Chateaubriand, and Victor Hugo, amongst others. He really liked Hugo, who he felt looked like the genius he was, but not his wife, who looked as if she might poison my breakfast any morning, or his daughter, who appeared with hardly any drapery above the waist. He spent 6 months in Lausanne in Switzerland with his wife, now 6 children, 4 maids and a dog, renting a substantial villa overlooking Lake Geneva and starting work on Dombey and Son, and another Christmas story, The Battle of Life. He enjoyed long walks and the clean air, but he struggled to find inspiration away from the hustle and bustle of London. Dombey and Son makes a significant change in his writing, as his novels become darker and more serious from this point. He also began to plan them more carefully than his earlier works, which had no overall structure at the outset, and had characters who were either expanded or dropped according to public reaction as each instalment appeared. His portrayals of women also start to become more complex. In Dombey and Son, he paints a sympathetic portrait of Alice Brown, a young woman seduced and then abandoned by the villain James Carker, forcing her into prostitution and crime and resulting in her transportation to the colonies. While he was away, he had continued writing to Miss Burdett Coutts, and on his return he found a property for their home for fallen women, Urania Cottage, in Shepherd's Bush, then a rural area 6 miles to the west of London. Detached, pleasantly situated, with a garden and space for 13 women. It's not clear when Dickens first took an interest in the plight of street girls, but living in London he would have encountered them on a daily basis, as there were around 80,000 in the city in the 1840s. Tolerated more in the 18th century, the prevailing view by this time was that they were a threat to society with their diseases and their moral laxity. The economic realities of their lives were largely ignored, and it was widely believed that women took to the trade because of their innate lustfulness and sinful natures. Perhaps because of his own very real encounters with the powerlessness of poverty, Dickens had a more understanding view, and the idea behind Urania Cottage was that it would give women who had fallen into prostitution accommodation and education in a pleasant, family-like home, and the opportunity to prepare themselves for leading better lives. Unlike other reformatories, the emphasis was on creating a safe and happy domestic environment, rather than being forced to contemplate their sins in cold, prison-like conditions, wearing drab uniforms and sitting in silence to demonstrate their repentance.
At Urania, the staff were under strict instructions not to ask any of the women about their pasts. The focus was entirely on the future.
They were well fed, taught to read and write, grow vegetables, and a piano and singing lessons were provided, which provided much contemporary comment on the inappropriateness of such luxuries. Dickens's involvement in the project was far more than as a mere figurehead. He managed every detail of its day-to-day running, interviewing applicants for admission, selecting the staff, and sorting out repairs. In her excellent book on Urania, Jenny Hartley comments this was a role he relished. It was another total world for him to control. Here he could create and run everything according to his rules. He was personally involved in the progress of each woman, and began noting down their stories in a casebook, very much to the detriment of his own family, who felt increasingly neglected.
But this, like so much other information that may have provided insights into Dickens's life, no longer exists.
So, whether his interest was purely philanthropic or motivated by a degree of voyeurism, we don't know. But of the first 54 cases, 30 emigrated and built good lives in the colonies, 14 left of their own accord, and 10 were expelled as irredeemable. A success rate far higher than Prime Minister William Gladstone, who estimated that of the 90 women he talked to, at length and often followed by self-scourging if he got overexcited, only one abandoned her miserable life through his efforts. Dombey and Son was to return to winning ways as far as the public was concerned, the first issues selling out in days, and his earnings helped restore his finances, which were seriously depleted after his foreign travels. So he rewarded himself by taking a break before embarking on his next novel, spending his time with daily visits to Urania, and directing and acting in amateur theatricals with friends and family. Triggered by an innocent remark by his friend John Forster about meeting someone who had seen him working as a boy, Dickens dashed off an autobiographical fragment about his days at the dingy boot-blacking factory and gave it to Forster to do with as he saw fit, who carefully put it away to use in his biography which appeared after Dickens's death. He had not spoken of these times to anyone in 20 years, not even his wife. Whether he hoped that by consigning the painful memories to ink and paper and filing them away with Forster would clear them from his mind, we don't know. But such powerful memories could not be so easily dismissed, and his last Christmas book, The Haunted Man, is about a man who broods on the wrongs done him in the past. And his next novel, David Copperfield, was the most personal of his novels and the one which drew most heavily on his own childhood experiences. Of his many works, it was his favourite, and although it is now acknowledged as one of his finest works, it had modest sales of 25,000 copies per instalment and mixed reviews. Dickens, however, was pleased, writing to the dedicatee, "Everyone is cheering David on." In 1851, while he was acting in an amateur production of a play by his friend Edward Bulwer Lytton, Dickens met Wilkie Collins, and the two became close friends, travelling and working together and sharing a dedication to reforming a society which, for all its power and wealth, treated many of its subjects like cattle. Having been reconciled with his parents in recent years, Dickens was shocked when he heard that his father, who'd been plagued by bladder stones, had turned to the last desperate remedy, surgery.
an incision between the anus and scrotum, no anaesthetic, and a lithotomy scoop inserted to prise out any stones. All done completely blind and with barely a hand wash by anyone in the room.
The procedure hadn't changed for centuries and was both extremely painful and commonly complicated by leakages, infection, or death. On hearing the news of his father's operation, Charles rushed to see him, arriving just after the bloodbath was over. But for John Dickens, like so many others, it didn't go well. He survived the surgery, but over the next few days he went downhill. He was confused and rambling, and towards the end he didn't recognise anybody. Dickens didn't sleep for 3 days, pacing the streets in a vain attempt to tire himself out. But as head of the family, he had to compose himself. He assured his mother he would look after her, and arranged his father's funeral at Highgate Cemetery. While all this was going on, Catherine was taking the water cure at Malvern Spa, and Dickens rushed back and forth to be with her and deal with engagements in London.
But just 2 weeks after his father's passing, while he was speaking at a dinner engagement, his youngest daughter, Dora, just 8 months old, previously fit and well, started having convulsions and died.
Later in the year, the Dickens family moved again, this time to Tavistock House, where he wrote Bleak House, a powerful critique of the corruption of the legal system and injustice in English society. In response to the unnecessary death of a young boy, the narrator declares, "Dead, Your Majesty, dead, my lords and gentlemen, dead, right reverends and wrong reverends of every order, dead, men and women, born with heavenly compassion in your hearts, and dying thus around us every day." In addition to churning out his novels, the hard-working Dickens was also the publisher, editor and major contributor to a weekly journal, Household Words, containing a mixture of fiction, non-fiction and commentary on domestic news and foreign affairs. Through the journal he declared his support for Italian reunification and helped raise funds for the cause, making a second trip to Switzerland and Italy in 1853. But this time leaving his family back home and travelling with the artist Augustus Egg and his new bestie, Wilkie Collins. He had always been interested in matters of public health and was a regular reader of The Lancet, Britain's leading medical journal, and he wrote several articles about the benefits of smallpox vaccination and was supportive of legislation which introduced compulsory vaccination for children after 2 devastating outbreaks in successive years. Smallpox also rears its ugly head in Bleak House. Also in Household Words, he was critical of Arctic explorer John Rae for his reports to the Admiralty suggesting that members of Franklin's ill-fated expedition to find the Northwest Passage a decade earlier had resorted to cannibalism. But the sales figures for his magazine were not always what he hoped for. So the wily businessman Dickens published his next novel, Hard Times, his only one not based at least partly in London, in 20 weekly parts over the spring and summer months. The ploy worked and sales improved, and he achieved his other objective of highlighting the terrible conditions in the factories of Lancashire. But although everything was going well in his writing, at home major cracks were beginning to appear in his relationship with Catherine. She was now 40, and after 10 children and at least 2 miscarriages, she was not the petite young woman he had married, and he began writing to his first love, Maria Beadnell, whose parents had intervened to break up their romance 20 years previously. When he met her, however, surprise, surprise, she was no longer a petite young woman either, and it went no further. In 1855 he took his 2 eldest daughters to Paris for some Parisian polish. Mary, aged 17, and Katie, 16, had dancing lessons, art classes and language coaching. Later in the year, the first instalment of Little Dorrit appeared, in which debt and the Marshalsea prison play prominent parts. In recent years, Dickens had moved his family to grander and grander houses, and by 1856 his income was sufficient for him to buy Gad's Hill Place in Higham, Kent, 25 miles from London, but not far from Chatham. It was a house he had often walked past as a child and dreamt of living in, and it was the first house he bought outright for £1,700. In the same year, in collaboration with Wilkie Collins, Dickens reworked his ideas about Franklin's Arctic expedition into a play, The Frozen Deep. Initially performed by himself and family members at home for small private audiences, it was given a grander setting at the Royal Gallery of Illustration for Queen Victoria, who praised the performance, especially the acting of Mr. Dickens. In an effort to raise funds for the widow of his friend, writer Francis Gerald, Dickens then organised a series of much larger public performances at the Manchester Free Trade Hall. But concerned that amateur actresses would not be able to project their voices in such a large venue, he arranged professionals instead, one of whom was Ellen Ternan.
Blonde, blue-eyed Nellie Turnham was 18, younger than his daughter Mary, when the 45-year-old Dickens hired her to appear in his play.
Everything about her signalled innocence and vulnerability, writes Claire Tomalin in her biography. In her neat little dresses and ringlets, she could have stepped out of a fairy story. The whole Ternan family were notable actors, and Nellie had been on stage since the age of 3, but her father had died a few months before in Bethnal Green Insane Asylum, leaving the Turnans in a precarious situation.
What happened next remains hotly disputed. Officially, nothing. They were just friends.
But according to his own children, Nellie became his lover and was in a relationship with him for the remaining 14 years of his life, living in homes he rented for her under false names, but keeping her head down and staying well away from the public gaze. They even had a son together who died in infancy.
There is a theory that she was not his mistress, but his daughter. But this doesn't really explain what happened next.
In May 1858, a rather lovely bracelet meant for Nellie was delivered by mistake to his wife. Some kind of discussion took place, solicitors were brought in, finances were agreed, and Dickens and his wife separated forever. This was all rather shocking for Victorian England, and in response to widespread rumours and gossip, Dickens sent an open letter to his manager that soon found its way into the newspapers, claiming that he and his wife had been living unhappily together for many years, and that she had thrown the care of the children onto someone else, her sister Georgina, and become estranged due to a mental disorder. To quell the rumours of his affair with Ternan, he declared, "Upon my soul and honour, there is not on this earth a more virtuous and spotless creature than that young lady. I know her to be innocent and pure and as good as my own dear daughters." He made similar accusations about Catherine's mental state privately, writing to a friend that Catherine's mind has, at times, been certainly confused. At the time, the stigma and shame of mental illness was enormous, and nobody would have been under any misapprehensions about what he was suggesting, that Catherine was insane.
Whether anyone believed him at the time, we don't know. But he gave his friends a choice: accept his account and have nothing to do with his wife, or have nothing to do with him.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning clearly did not believe a word of it, writing, "What a dreadful letter that was, and what a crime for a man to use his genius as a cudgel against the woman he promised to protect tenderly with life and heart. I call it dreadful." And neither did Angela Burdett Coutts, the funder of Urania House, and he lost all interest in the project. Or fellow novelist Thackeray, which led to a falling out and Dickens banning his children from having any further contact with the Thackeray family. Letters that have turned up recently show an even darker side to the whole affair. Dickens tried to get a doctor to take her away and lock her up in an asylum. He approached Dr. Thomas Harrington Tuke, superintendent of Manor House Asylum in Chiswick, West London. Tuke, who was from a famous family of alienists, was well known to Dickens and had exchanged several letters with him, and was a guest at the christening of one of his sons. But he evidently stood his ground and did not agree to having Catherine put away, and a few years later Dickens was referring to him as a wretched being and a medical donkey. Die-hard Dickens supporters might think he genuinely believed his wife to be in need of care in an asylum, rather than just trying to get her out of the way. After all, she had suffered from a lot of postnatal depression. But it seems rather suspicious that his friend and fellow novelist Edward Bulwer-Lytton, after whom his youngest son was named, got his wife admitted to an asylum at exactly the same time, after she continued denouncing him publicly after their acrimonious separation, even though a doctor had declared her perfectly sane 2 weeks earlier.
Catherine would have been in no doubt as to her husband's powers of persuasion, so she agreed to leave quietly before he was able to approach any other less scrupulous asylum doctors.
Their eldest son Charlie was allowed to go with her, but Catherine never saw or spoke to her husband again. He gave her an annual allowance of £600, but exercised his paternal rights over the other children who remained with him at Gad's Hill under the care of their Aunt Georgina. They were allowed to have contact with their mother, but his daughter Kate later said that she barely spoke to her father for 2 years after the separation, as he knew she occasionally saw her mother. He also forced his wife to sign a document saying there was no truth in the rumours that Georgina was attending to his needs as well as the children's, increasing her allowance to encourage her to do so. After the separation, Dickens embarked on a series of popular and lucrative reading tours, which took up most of his time. These, and the work involved in producing his journal, meant that he would complete only 2 novels over the next decade. The first 10-month tour consisted of 129 appearances in 49 towns in England, Scotland and Ireland, and the fallout from their very public separation seems to have done little to diminish his popularity. In 1859, the first issue of his new weekly literary magazine, All the Year Round, began a serialisation of The Tale of Two Cities. It has become one of the most popular novels of all time, but contemporary critic James Fitzjames Stephen called it a dish of puppy pie and stewed cat which is not disguised by the cooking, and a disjointed framework for the display of the tawdry wares which are Mr. Dickens's stock in trade. The last instalment was published alongside the first instalment of Wilkie Collins's new novel The Woman in White, whose central character, Laura Fairley, is wrongly confined in an asylum by her wicked husband so that he can get his hands on her money. The novel was inspired by 2 high-profile cases that both Collins and Dickens were aware of: Louisa Nottage, who was abducted from a religious community and placed in an asylum, and Caroline Norton, who was prevented from seeing her children after leaving her violent husband.
It seems incredible that just 18 months after his own shabby treatment of his wife, that Dickens felt able to publish a story highlighting the unfairness of women's rights at this time.
How could a man who seemed so attuned to the suffering and exploitation of others, who was willing to advocate at times for unpopular causes such as fallen women, how could a man who seemed so keen to do the right thing have been so blind to his own failings?
I suspect he convinced himself that he had done the right thing in separating from Catherine, and that any failings were hers and hers alone, and woe betide anyone who said different.
His daughter Kate later described this time as a difficult period.
My father was like a madman. This affair brought out all that was worst, all that was weakest in him. He did not care a damn what happened to any of us. Nothing could surpass the misery and unhappiness of our home.
In order to escape the now cheerless family home, Kate asked permission to marry Charles Collins, an artist and writer, and brother of Dickens's friend Wilkie. At first he refused, as he disapproved of Wilkie's domestic situation, openly living with Caroline Graves, a shop girl with an illegitimate child. But he eventually agreed, and they were married in July 1860 at Gad's Hill Place. That evening, his eldest daughter Mamie found her father weeping into Kate's wedding dress, blaming himself for her choosing a loveless marriage to a semi-invalid, 12 years older, just to get away. 2 months later, Dickens burnt thousands of letters in a huge bonfire at Gad's Hill. It wasn't an angry, impulsive gesture, but a systematic destruction of all of his personal correspondence from the past 20 years. The children were called in to carry basket after basket of letters, and they pleaded for him to keep some. But the only ones he kept were business-related. Anything and everything personal went into the flames. All of his early letters to Catherine and her responses to him went up in smoke. 11-year-old Henry remembered roasting onions in the hot ashes. Afterwards, he also wrote to his friends asking them to destroy all the letters he had sent them over the years. Was this a symbolic act to remove all trace that he had ever loved his wife? To make it easier for him to justify his betrayal?
Or simply trying to get rid of any incriminating evidence of his role in trying to get his wife dragged off to a lunatic asylum?
Or a bit of both? In his biography, Peter Ackroyd has argued that it is significant that 3 weeks later he began work on Great Expectations, a novel in which he is engaged in exorcising the influence of the past by rewriting it. The first instalments appeared in December in All the Year Round, selling 100,000 copies each week. But when the novel concluded the following year, reviews were mixed, Blackwood's magazine finding it feeble, fatigued, colourless, and Dublin University magazine going as far as suggesting it was evidence of the growing weakness of a once mighty genius. His son Charlie, recently returned from a tea-buying trip to China and India, told his father of his wish to marry Bessie Evans, the daughter of his former publisher Frederick Evans, with whom he had fallen out for taking his wife's side after the separation. Dickens blamed Catherine for his son's odious choice, and even tried to stop his friends attending the wedding. Even as his own family was disintegrating, he was still being called on to help his family of origin. He gave financial support to his brother Augustus, who had moved to America, as well as the wife he had left behind. He also took responsibility for his mother's care and support, as by this time she needed constant attention as she had developed dementia. He wrote, "My mother, who was left to me when my father died, I never had anything left to me but relations, is in the strangest state of mind from senile decay, and the impossibility of getting her to understand what is the matter, combined with her desire to be got up in sables like a female Hamlet, illumines the dreary scene with a ghastly absurdity."
Although senile decay sounds dreadful today, it was the most commonly used term for dementia in the 19th century.
Her condition progressed relentlessly, and she was described as hopelessly senile towards the end. She finally succumbed in 1863 and was buried with her husband in Highgate Cemetery. Charles, the great writer, naturally wrote the epitaph for the gravestone, but could bring himself to say only, "Here also lie the remains of Elizabeth Dickens, who died September 12, 1863, aged 73 years. This wasn't the only death he had to contend with. While working in India, his son Walter got into debt. Dickens was furious and refused to send him money to solve the problem, but Walter wrote to his sister to say he was very ill, and arrangements were made to bring him home. But on New Year's Eve, while talking with other patients in the hospital, he became rather excited, and a violent coughing fit came over him, bursting an aneurysm, and he was dead within seconds by the rush of blood which poured from his mouth. The serialisation of his next novel, Our Mutual Friend, began in May 1864, in monthly instalments of 32 pages priced at £1 each. Sales were solid at 35,000 for the first issue, but not spectacular, and initial reviews found the book too complex and the characters rather flat. In June 1865, while returning from Paris with Ellen Ternan and her mother, Dickens was involved in the Staplehurst rail crash in Kent. Workmen were replacing timbers on a cast-iron bridge and had removed a rail. The The foreman had checked the wrong day's timetable, so was not expecting the train, which travelling at 50 miles an hour was unable to stop, and the train's first 7 carriages were derailed and plunged off the bridge. Dickens's carriage was also derailed, but the coupling broke, so it was left hanging precariously, and he was able to climb out of a window. For 3 hours he tended and comforted the wounded and dying with a flask of brandy and water carried in his top hat. He later wrote, "No imagination can conceive the ruin of the carriages, or the extraordinary weights under which people were lying, or the complications into which they were twisted up among iron and wood and mud and water."
He was so shaken up, he almost left the unfinished manuscript of the latest instalment of Our Mutual Friend in the carriage, but remembered at the last moment and retrieved it.
He managed to avoid an appearance at the inquest concerning the crash, as this would have meant disclosing that he had been travelling with Ternan. But the foreman, Henry Benge, was blamed and later found guilty of culpable negligence in the performance of his duty. The judge was lenient, however, and sentenced him to only 9 months in prison, saying that he should have been better supervised. Benge never gave himself, however, and he ended up in the Kent County Lunatic Asylum where he died. It also had a lasting psychological impact on Dickens. He missed a deadline for Our Mutual Friend, something that had not happened since being immobilised by grief after his sister-in-law Mary's death 30 years before. And he was always nervous when travelling by train afterwards, using alternative means of transport whenever possible. He wrote, "I have sudden vague rushes of terror, even when riding in a hansom cab, which are perfectly unreasonable but quite insurmountable." His son Henry recalled, "I have seen him sometimes in a railway carriage when there was a slight jolt. When this happened, he was almost in a state of panic and gripped the seat with both hands." His daughter Mary described an even more vivid occasion. "My father suddenly clutched the arms of the railway carriage seat, while his face grew ashy pale, and great drops of perspiration stood upon his forehead. And though he tried hard to master the dread, it was so strong that we had to leave the train at the next station." But never one to waste an experience, Dickens used the disaster, as well as his growing interest in the paranormal and spiritualism, as material for his ghost story, The Signalman, in which the central character has a premonition of his own death in a rail crash. His son said that Dickens never really recovered from the experience, and it has been suggested that he developed what would now be called post-traumatic stress disorder, and that this affected his productivity for the remaining 5 years of his life, and led to him focusing more on giving readings than writing new stories. At first sight, this seems a plausible explanation, but one of the criticisms of attempting to give modern diagnoses to symptoms reported by historical figures is that they are taken out of their historical context and the context of what else was happening in the individual's life at the time.
And this may be the case with Dickens's declining health. It could be that he was suffering from the psychological effects of the crash, or something completely different.
Such as a rare neurological syndrome arising from an impaired blood supply to the parietal lobe of the brain. This suggestion comes from some very unusual symptoms, which first occurred 2 months before the rail crash. Being unable to read the right-hand side of words, accompanied by pain, hypersensitivity and swelling of his left foot, such that he couldn't bear it to be touched. Dickens himself attributed this to frostbite, but his doctors thought it was gout. But taking all of his symptoms together, it could have been an early sign of the vascular condition that eventually caused his demise from a stroke. After the success of his first American reading tour, Dickens had long been thinking about a second visit, but the Civil War had delayed his plans. But by 1867 the time was right, and he set sail from Liverpool to Boston. In his first month he was entertained at literary dinners with Emerson, Longfellow, and just about anybody else who was anybody. But then began his punishing schedule of readings, 76 in 5 months, financially rewarding, earning him over $3 million in modern terms, but physically exhausting. 22 of these were at Steinway Hall in New York, and one, on New Year's Eve, was attended by a young Mark Twain on his first date with the woman who would become his wife. Twain's description of the reading for the San Francisco newspaper Alta California provides a vivid and less reverential account of Dickens than most other contemporary reviews. He was a tall, spry, thin-legged old gentleman, gotten up regardless of expense, especially as to shirt front and diamonds, with a bright red flower in his buttonhole, grey beard and moustache, bald head, and with side hair brushed fiercely and tempestuously forward, as if the owner was sweeping down before a gale of wind. He did not emerge upon the stage, that is rather too deliberate a word. He strode in the most English way.
I'm not quite sure what striding in an English way means, but Twain makes a big thing of Dickens's Englishness, even poking fun at his Englishy pronunciation.
Twain was clearly disappointed. Mr. Dickens's reading is rather monotonous. His voice is husky. His pathos is only the beautiful pathos of his language. There is no heart, no feeling in it. It is glittering frostwork. His rich humour cannot fail to tickle an audience into ecstasies, save when he reads it himself. Perhaps Twain's expectations had been too high, or perhaps Dickens's disappointing performance that night was the result of what he called his American catarrh, a bad cold or possibly influenza, which had left him in a very faint and shady state. Barely eating and too weak to do the thing that more than anything else helped him keep his equilibrium, walking.
The catarrh lingered, and on the advice of a doctor, he cancelled the Canadian and St. Louis sections of the tour.
But by the end he could hardly manage solid food, subsisting on champagne and eggs beaten in sherry, and it was a completely exhausted Dickens that returned to Britain. Safely back in Blighty, and after a few months to recover, he embarked on another punishing schedule of lectures in England, Scotland and Ireland. But his health was deteriorating. Of the 100 appearances he agreed to, he managed 87. But increasingly he was affected by episodes of dizziness and temporary paralysis, and after a minor stroke in April 1869, the rest of the tour was cancelled on his doctor's advice. But never one for sitting still, he began work on his final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and for research he visited the slums and opium dens of East London. But perhaps aware that time was running out, his usual arrangement for his novels to be published in 20 monthly instalments was reduced to 12. Feeling a little stronger, he arranged a final series of 12 readings in early 1870, and his last public appearance was in May at a Royal Academy banquet in the presence of the Prince and Princess of Wales, where, despite being very frail, he read from A Christmas Carol and the Pickwick Papers.
A month later, he had another stroke after a day's working on Edwin Drood at Gad's Hill. He never regained consciousness and died the following day.
His wish was to have been buried at Rochester Cathedral in an inexpensive, unostentatious and strictly private manner. But this was never going to be enough for the man who was Britain's, probably the world's, most popular author at the time. Instead, he was interred in Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of countless kings and queens and so many of his literary forebears. In his eulogy, Dean Stanley described him as a genial and loving humourist, and a printed epitaph circulating at the time read, "He was a sympathiser with the poor, the suffering and the oppressed, and by his death one of England's greatest writers is lost to the world." In his will, which he changed a week before he died, he left money to his servants, his children, his sister-in-law Georgina Hogarth, and his longtime friend John Forster. His wife gets a brief mention, but it is Miss Ellen Lawless Turnan's name that appears first, receiving the sum of £1,000, around £150,000 today. So, 150 years after his passing, what can be said about Charles Dickens? He still provokes controversy, whether because of his jingoistic comments about the Indian Mutiny of 1857, or claims of anti-Semitism in his portrayal of Fagin. Even the erecting of the first statue to him in Britain in Portsmouth in 2014 drew protests from those who said he expressly forbade any monument to himself in his will.
His books are still read and made into films and TV series, and I've watched quite a few of these as I've been researching this video.
His characters remain fresh and believable, and must have the most evocative names in literature, my personal favourites being the cheerless Thomas Gradgrind in Hard Times, and the psychopathic lawyer in Bleak House, Mr. Tulkinghorn. Some of Dickens's characters have become part of the collective unconscious. Oliver asking for more, Mr. Micawber's eternal optimism, but especially Ebenezer Scrooge, who despite his miraculous transformation is always remembered for his miserliness. Some have even found their way into medical syndromes. The Pickwickian syndrome, now termed obesity hypoventilation syndrome, is named after Joe in the Pickwick Papers, who was always eating and falling asleep. There was also a suggestion that the Diogenes syndrome of hoarding be renamed Miss Havisham's syndrome, but this never caught on. And as well as his writing, he deserves to be remembered for his highlighting of the terrible conditions of child labour and lack of education for the poor, and for his efforts in raising funds for institutions as varied as the Rehabilitation Home for Fallen Women and the world-leading children's hospital Great Ormond Street. But what of his personality? Those who have attempted to define his personality have struggled, coming up against the enormous contradictions in his character. Kind, considerate and sensitive, yet chillingly selfish and vindictive in his relationship with his wife. Sociable, charming and witty, but also prickly, argumentative and easily offended by criticism. Generous with his time and money, yet obsessed by money, continuing his reading tours long after he was financially secure. He certainly had secrets, and was very successful at keeping his affair with Nellie Turner quiet during his life, and afterwards. Whether there are any other secrets yet to be revealed, we don't know. Mary Hogarth, Georgina Hogarth, the conveniences of Margate he wrote to the artist Daniel Maclise about. One thing everyone agrees on was that Dickens had enormous energy and a huge appetite for work. Forster describes his quickness, keenness and practical power, and his eager, restless, energetic outlook. His rushing around, constant novelty-seeking and lifelong habit of going on long walks at night has led Irish developmental disorder specialist Michael Fitzgerald to suggest he had ADHD.
But I'm not convinced by this. He certainly packed a lot in, but when he wanted to focus, he did it rather well.
Dickens suffered from severe insomnia for much of his life, and when he couldn't sleep, he would get out of bed and walk the streets of London for hours, marching down tree-lined avenues and the darkest back alleys to tire himself out, so that he could get some sleep on his return. He was also troubled by recurring dreams about his childhood, and maintained a rather unusual nocturnal routine of lying in the middle of his bed, his head pointing north, his arms outstretched, and his hands equidistant from the edges, in the belief that this somehow enhanced his creativity. He was fascinated by the twilight in-between world of dreams and marginal consciousness. He owned a copy of one of the latest medical texts on sleep and its disorders, and corresponded with authors on the nature of dreams. Some have suggested that Dickens's high energy was the result of bipolar affective disorder, but my own view is that he didn't go through the cycles of mania and depression that would characterise this disorder. He was always buzzing. I don't think he had a major mental disorder. He was troubled by memories of his childhood at times, and he did become anxious about going on trains. He was certainly different from the average man, off the scale in his energy levels and communication skills, but that is what made him what he was, one of the greatest writers ever. I do, however, think He was one of the first casualties of celebrity culture. All the praise, adulation and worshipping of the ground he stood on was too much. It inflated his ego and made him believe that he and his writing were more important than anything else, more important than the woman who bore him 10 children, more important than the children themselves. I wonder if he ever felt regret at how he treated Catherine and continued to treat her after their separation, or whether he believed his own fiction that it was all her fault.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope that learning that Dickens was all too human hasn't put you off his work. If you want to learn more about Dickens, there are so many books about his life, the women in his life, the letters he wrote, just about everything. It's hard to know where to begin, but I'd recommend the biography by Claire Tomerlin. It gives a balanced account, not shying away from his less worthy moments, but not getting them out of proportion either. As always, I'd love to hear your views about the inimitable Mr. Dickens, and any other suggestions you may have for who I should tackle next. And please remember to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.